Hi, my name is Monica Moore. I'm a registered dietitian, and this is my IRB proposal on vitamin D and weight loss. My research question: does weight loss and reduction of adipose tissue increase serum vitamin D levels in obese adult women? The null hypothesis is a decrease in weight and body fat does not increase vitamin D levels. My alternate hypothesis is a decrease in weight and body fat does increase vitamin D levels in adult obese women. So backing up for a little introduction about obesity and vitamin D, it's interesting to note that 39.8% of American adults are obese or overweight. That's 93.3 million people just in America. It's definitely a worldwide epidemic. Obesity can further be described as an increase in adipose tissue, which will be important in a few minutes when we start talking about vitamin D metabolism related to fat mass. Obesity for the purpose of this study is defined as a BMI of 30 kilograms per meter squared or higher. Vitamin D deficiency is defined as a level of 30 nanomoles per liter or less. And vitamin D deficiency is important to note that lots of studies have shown its prevalence in obese individuals, and we'll be talking a lot about this today. Vitamin D is a micronutrient typically produced through exposure of skin to sunlight. 80% of our vitamin D in our body is produced this way. It's a fat-soluble vitamin transported through the lymphatic system into the bloodstream. It converts to a usable form through two hydroxylation reactions, one in the liver, one in the kidneys. And this vitamin D25OH, which is that usable form of vitamin D, circulates in the blood and is stored in the adipose and muscle tissues. Again, the adipose storage is something that's important when we think about obesity and patients that typically have a higher fat mass. Some mechanisms for vitamin D deficiency include less skin exposure to the sun, reduction of synthesis of vitamin D, reduced intestinal absorption of vitamin D, and altered metabolism due to increased fat tissue. There's an increased uptake of vitamin D from the bloodstream by cells in obese populations who have more of that adipose tissue or those adipocytes than a healthy weight person. This overall dilutes the vitamin D level in the blood, leading to deficiency. This leads us to the idea that if increased weight and fat mass increases vitamin D uptake into the cells and thus reduces serum vitamin D levels, if weight and fat mass alone were reduced, would serum vitamin D levels then increase? So the purpose and goals of this study is to identify whether weight loss alone is beneficial for improvement or increase of serum vitamin D levels, and also to further the discussion about the benefits of weight loss over vitamin D supplementation alone in correcting D deficiency in obese adults. There's a concern that obese individuals with a higher adipose tissue may actually be having an increased uptake of vitamin D into the cells, and then even with supplementation, the intake is not enough of vitamin D to counteract this reaction. So it becomes a question of how effective vitamin D supplementation is in a population if their weight and fat mass stays elevated. Looking back at some current literature, there's so much research out there to support this connection in vitamin D and obesity. A 2017 review article found that research supports vitamin D levels being lower in obese adults across many different demographics. In an observational study in Saudi Arabia, women over 40 years old had a vitamin D level and BMI collected, assessed, compared over 4 months. In their analysis, they found that 69% of the 100 women studied were obese, and 84% of these obese women had vitamin D deficiency. It was also noted that 69.6% of the overweight women in the study also had vitamin D deficiency. Looking at a cross-sectional study in Naples, 104 adults aged 21 to 56 years old were enrolled in this outpatient clinic study, tested for vitamin D deficiency and other nutrient indicators across different BMI ranges. They found that 27.9% of the individuals were morbidly obese and 62% of the individuals in the study had vitamin D deficiency. Of those individuals with deficiency, the morbid obesity group had the lowest values of vitamin D. In this graphic, we can see the prevalence of vitamin D across BMI ranges. We can see the normal BMI down here has a lower prevalence, and we can see the obesity BMI up here in green has a much higher prevalence of vitamin D deficiency compared to that normal range. Another way looking at it, we have here BMI ranges and vitamin D deficiency connection, and we can see on the left that there's quite a bit of vitamin D deficiency occurring in these high BMI ranges. Another way to look at this similar visual is our vitamin D levels across the BMI ranges, and we can see in the BMIs of 30 to 34.9, 35 to 39.9, and over 40, the blue and red groups are the deficient groups, and the green group is the insufficient group. So we can see even in the 30 to 34.9 group right here, there's a huge prevalence of even just vitamin D insufficiency, even if it's not full-blown deficiency yet. Looking more into our studies, we have a 2017 review article comparing multiple studies that found that the supported conclusion of vitamin D levels being lower in obese adults was seen here too across demographics. A BMI allele score was used, and it was compared with allele scores for vitamin D. And of 42,024 participants, which is a huge study, it was found that 10% increase in BMI led to a 4.2% decrease in vitamin D levels. The inverse relationship was also seen between BMI and serum vitamin D levels in this cross-sectional study in China in 2016 with 1,277 participants, again, another very large study measuring body fat, BMI, and vitamin D levels. It noted a decrease in vitamin D levels as BMI and body fat, particularly abdominal obesity, increased. This visual goes along with that study, showing as BMI allele score increased, vitamin D synthesis and metabolism score decreased. Looking at the effects of weight loss specifically on vitamin D, one study investigating the connection between weight loss and its effects on serum vitamin D levels in obese women studied 44 women admitted to a local hospital clinic over a 6-month period. In that time, the dietary habits and demographics were collected through use of a questionnaire and food recall. Vitamin D levels and BMIs were calculated before and after the study. Women were in a weight loss program specifically and received nutrition education for that. It resulted in an intended 5 to 10% weight loss on average in the group, and it showed a positive correlation between vitamin D levels and BMI in the 5 to 10% weight loss group, and a negative correlation between the two values in those that lost over 10% of their body mass. This chart shows the results of that study, and it shows a statistically significant correlation between serum vitamin D and BMI in patients with the 5 to 10% loss, and a negative correlation between vitamin D and BMI values in the individuals with a greater than 10% weight loss. The difference in vitamin D levels in these individuals who lost more than 10% was also significant, and you can see they also looked at some different biochemical findings here in addition to just vitamin D, which would be interesting for pursuit in future studies. A final study that I'll talk about today showed a 439-person overweight and obese group. These were postmenopausal women studied over 12 months. They were separated into 4 groups: diet, exercise, and a control. And what they found was the serum vitamin D levels were increased as the percent body weight decreased, which is kind of interesting because, again, it just shows the same connection between vitamin D and weight that's so plentiful, even looking back at studies in just the past few years. While more research is still needed on this topic, and there's still a lot of directions it could be taken, the need, I think, is clear for continued research on this topic. This is why my study is so important and why the results of this study could be very significant in furthering the knowledge on vitamin D and weight and fat mass reduction. So backing up to my research question again, just to remind you what it was, does weight loss and reduction of adipose tissue increase serum vitamin D levels in obese adult women? So let's talk about my study. Subject recruitment. These will be recruited from Southern Maine Healthcare Bariatric Surgery Program in Maine. They will be adult women aged 18 to 64 with BMIs between 30 and 50 kilograms per meter squared, and they will be gastric sleeve candidates. Serum vitamin D levels will be over 20 nanograms per milliliter at the study start, which is actually SMHC protocol, and the American Society for Metabolic and Bariatric Surgery recommends that a vitamin D level pre-op under 20 is treated with D2 50,000 IUs once a week for 8 weeks and then rechecked to ensure that it's over 20 by surgery date. So as long as it's over 20 by the time the study starts and by the time they have their surgery, it will not be an exclusion for their participation. Adherence to Southern Maine Healthcare's bariatric program vitamin and mineral supplementation is also extremely important. Their protocol calls for vitamin D3 3,000 IUs daily, calcium citrate 1,500 milligrams daily, and a bariatric multivitamin daily. Training is going to occur in the office, and this will include height, weight, body fat percentages, and serum vitamin D levels. Estimated sample size for this study is going to be 210 individuals, ideally 105 per group. The sample size was determined by a G-power calculation through a t-test with an a priori equation. A medium effect size of 0.5 and a significance of p less than 0.05 was used to prove if there is a significant difference between means of the two groups. The G-power yielded 176 individuals in my calculation, and I accounted for a 20% attrition rate that brought us to our current sample size. Those that meet the inclusion criteria will be pitched the study by the researcher and have the opportunity to participate. The researcher will provide information about the study to these people, including risks and benefits. An informed consent will be provided and signed by those that agree to participate. They'll also receive a copy of this. And it's important to note that participation is voluntary and will be voluntary, so they can opt out of the study at any time if they choose. Participants, once they sign their informed consent, will be split into one of the two groups and receive a numerical coding identifier that will be used for the rest of the study in order to identify them. So no personal identifiers like name will be used going forward. The control group will be pre-surgical patients, likely not yet losing large amounts of weight. The case group will be post-surgical patients, likely losing significant amounts of weight. The length of the study will be 6 months from enrollment. This length was chosen as research shows that most dramatic and significant amount of weight loss is seen within 6 months in bariatric surgeries. Thus, this would be the time period with the greatest change in vitamin D due to fat loss potentially to be seen. Both groups also will receive that identical supplementation that we talked about of D3, calcium citrate, and multivitamin that is standard for this pre- and post-op program. Surveys will be completed prior to the start of the study, and these will collect information on possible confounding variables to vitamin D change, such as sun exposure, foods that are high in vitamin D, sunscreen use, things that could potentially just skew some of the results. They'll be done through a video FFQ, which is a vitamin D estimation only food frequency questionnaire, and through a sun exposure questionnaire, both of which are validated studies. The weights will be measured routinely at the office visits. Body mass measurements and serum vitamin D levels will be done at baseline and at the end of the study period, and all measurements will be done at the Southern Maine Healthcare office and collected by nursing, and the data will be emailed to the researcher with their numerical identifier. Once the researcher receives this data, it'll be plugged into an Excel spreadsheet by the researcher. All labs will be performed by LabCorp for consistency of reporting values, reference ranges, and units of measurement, as every lab can be a little bit different. Confidentiality will be maintained through coding of the participant data and use of that numerical identifier. The Excel spreadsheet will contain the collected data. The email account and computer used by the researcher for the Excel spreadsheet and the data collection will be password protected and only for use by that researcher. There are no additional risks to participating in this study. And then benefits include complimentary office visits, and participants are going to receive their vitamin and mineral supplements free of charge for the entire study period. This will encourage compliance to the recommended regimen and consistency between the two groups in an attempt to limit any confounding variables of the difference of any supplementation. This will go with the goal of isolating the weight and fat loss as that independent variable. Quantitative data is going to be measured. This includes percent weight change, percent fat mass change, and the mean vitamin D level changes. They'll be compared from start to finish in each group and compared at finish between the two groups. This mean vitamin D level change between groups at the end of the study will allow for any difference in vitamin D levels to be seen with or without weight loss as the independent variable. Independent t-tests will be used to determine statistical significance, and if the null hypothesis can be rejected, the NCSS data analysis software will be used for calculations, and the G-power test and G-power analysis software will be used to identify the ideal sample size needed, as previously discussed. Expected results are an increase in serum vitamin D levels in the case group and an inverse association between percentage of weight and/or fat lost and vitamin D levels. Therefore, as the weight goes down, the vitamin D level goes up. Controlling for vitamin D supplementation between the groups should allow for a more isolated result based on weight and fat mass changes. Potential benefits for this study outweigh the risks. Results could potentially improve knowledge of the vitamin D and obesity association. They could provide another benefit of weight loss and the reduction of obesity. The limiting factor, unfortunately, is those lifestyle factors from the surveys that were not able to be accounted for. In conclusion, further opportunities from this research could be to examine whether supplementation or weight loss yields better vitamin D improvements, and it could be applied in physician offices for testing of vitamin D in obese patients, as well as influence their recommendations for vitamin D supplementation in these patients, as we know they absorb it differently. It also would be another indicator to encourage weight loss and reduction of obesity. So now I'll open up the floor for any questions. While you're thinking, thank you so much for letting me present, and here are my references.